Good evening to both our in-person audience and those joining us from Facebook Live. And we want to welcome you to this month's Friends of the Missouri State Archives Thursday evening speaker series. My name is John Dugan. I have the pleasure of serving here as State Archivist in the Secretary of State's office. We're thrilled to have you here tonight. Tonight, we welcome back to the archives, though, Missouri State University Professor Jeremy Neely. Some of you are probably here when he presented in March of 2022 on political nativism and in the antebellum West. I think that's recorded and on our website, so you can go back and watch that program. Also, we're very proud that you were the 2020 recipient of the William Foley Research Fellowship, which is also funded by the Friends to support academic research. So looking forward to hearing your program tonight, Jeremy.
Thank you, John. I'd also like to thank the Friends and for the archives to have us all out tonight, and I appreciate you all taking the time to be here. The couple that I'm happy to introduce you to tonight were not the subject that I ever intended to really dig into, and certainly not something that I thought I would write a book about, but it was a happy series of discoveries that led me to Lucy and Henry Fike. And I will, throughout the comments tonight, refer to her as Lucy, because that's what she would often use for herself, but her full name was Cymbeline Lucy Fike. But Henry and Lucy Fike, this book, Union Tested, came out from the University of Georgia Press last December. But as I said, it was not something that I expected to work on, because I had an idea for another one that I was excited to dig into about Missouri after the Civil War. And as I was early on in the research for that, I stumbled across an incredible diary up in Columbia at the State Historical Society. And the author of this diary, Henry Fike, was a mill owner in Warrensburg. And I found that he had been keeping a diary from the point at which he was in college in 1851 all the way through 1919. And it wasn't consistent every day for every year, but for most days across most years. And so it was just a staggeringly prolific guy. And I wondered, well, does he have anything else out there? Has he written letters? Are these maybe scattered in different archives? And lo and behold, there were. But they were not in Columbia, Missouri, but instead they were in, of all places, Lawrence, Kansas. And so I made my way across to the Spencer Library and found that different descendants of the Fikes had made gifts to different repositories. And so his massive diary ended up in Columbia, but the letters that he had written to his wife, Lucy, across the Civil War, they were across the state line in Kansas. Prior to moving to Missouri in 1866, the Fikes had lived in the town of Mascoutah, Illinois, which sits in St. Clair County, about 30 miles east of St. Louis, just across the river. In August of 1862, so 1 year into the war, Henry went off to fight and was appointed lieutenant colonel of the 117th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. Across the almost 3 years of his service, he wrote back to Lucy some 300 letters. But what really grabbed me and pulled me into this project was the discovery that Lucy had written back 100 letters. And that was a remarkable thing, because too often, and this is the stuff of which historians work, and so we're grateful for all of it, but the vast majority of what we have are the letters from the soldier that make it home and therefore are somewhat more easily kept. But the letters that these guys got in the field, it's hard to keep track of dozens and even hundreds of letters as they're marching across the mud and the snow and all kinds of conditions. But Henry was a former school teacher, and so he was pretty pedantic and was fond of reminding his wife how he wanted her to take good care of his letters, because, of course, he would take good care of hers. But I was very grateful to have that. Henry and Lucy came at their correspondence from much different directions. Henry was a terrific writer. He had gone to college and then worked for several years as both a teacher and principal. He had led their church's Sunday school for many years, and clearly was a guy who had spent most of his life in books. And for a researcher, his work is a gold mine because he paid attention to everything. And so he wrote about everything. His diary entries aren't just the routine kind of, here's the weather today, here's what I did, in a sentence. He went on and on and on. And so across the course of the war, he's talking about every dimension of the service. He's talking about the enthusiasm of mustering in, the anxiety of never knowing where he and his comrades would go next. He writes about the relentless boredom and the ways that soldiers tried to cut the tedium of their long days. He talks about the thrill and the terror of combat. But along the way, weather crops the landscapes that he saw. His letters are very much a travelogue of the Trans-Mississippi West, politics, race, church, and of course the war. One other note, Henry was appointed to be the quartermaster of his regiment, and therefore most everything that the men of his regiment needed passed under his watchful eye. And so food was something that he talked a lot about. And along the way, he complicated my assumptions of military service because we think of the chow that soldiers often have to force down, MREs today, but hardtack back in the Civil War. But Henry Fike ate pretty well. And over the course of the war, he remarked frequently about how much he kept gaining weight, which is not the kind of thing that you would expect of a Civil War soldier. As I noted, his letters become really a guide to the Trans-Appalachian West, I should say. He spends a lot of time beyond the Mississippi. But they muster in at Camp Butler, which is just outside of Springfield, Illinois. They then moved downriver to Memphis, Tennessee, and they will remain at Memphis serving garrison duty inside of Fort Pickering longer than anywhere else in the war. They had hoped they would be able to join the Union campaign that was developing downstream at Vicksburg, but they never do, and that becomes a pattern of much of his enlistment, is that they always seem to be just behind where a lot of the action is happening. They did take part in the Red River campaign down in northern Louisiana in early 1864. They also march into Arkansas, the Meridian Campaign in Mississippi. Tonight I'm going to focus on their march across Missouri, chasing after Sterling Price and his Confederates. But beyond Missouri, they will fight in Tennessee at the Battle of Nashville. And at the end of the war, they have sailed from New Orleans across the Gulf over to Mobile, where they will participate in the siege of that city. And then when the war comes to an end, they are in Montgomery, Alabama. And so by his count, his regiment had traveled 4,000 miles in just 1864 alone. So well-traveled, a lot of it by foot, some by rail, much of it by steamboat. And at a time when transportation is relatively slow and out of the reach of many people, he is one of the people who, in the war, learns about his country. It's a big country. It's a diverse country. And his letters become a kind of revelation in the way that his wife and his family come to learn about the rest of the world. But as much as I like Henry's stuff, it was the letters from Lucy that really convinced me that this project had legs. There were many things about her that won me over. The first was her apparent growth over the course of the war. Unlike Henry, who had graduated from McKendree College in Lebanon, Illinois, Lucy did not have a lot of formal education. Her early letters were a few sentences long, and you can see in them a very tentative voice, that they're mostly the kind of formulaic stuff that you see when you read a lot of Civil War letters. And so the letter would begin, "Dear Henry, it is with great pleasure that I take my pen in hand," and then she might say a couple other things, and that was it. And the spelling, as was frequently the case in the 19th century, spelling's all over the place, and it took some time to figure out what exactly Cymbeline was trying to say, but hers was a very phonetic kind of writing, and so if you can say it out loud, you get what it was she was trying to do. But there's no standardized spelling. But within a year of the correspondence with her husband, she was cranking out letters more than a dozen pages long. And it was a remarkable thing to behold. And what I found, and what I argue in the book, is that the Civil War becomes a kind of classroom. What the Civil War forces people to do is, for much of their lives, people did not have the time or the means or the opportunity to write, but in order to sustain relationships with loved ones who are serving hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 miles away, they had to take up their pens in order to stay in touch. And in an era today when we have, cell phones in our pocket and instant messages and texts and ways of reaching people any moment at any time, it might seem like a poor substitute to have to send a letter into the post and to wait a couple of weeks maybe at the best to hear back from them. But this becomes what I call an epistolary bridge. This is how they're able to meet while he is all over the West. There's another reason that, and this is the big one, that I really liked her, is that she's a very recognizable person. That there's something very modern about her. We have a tendency when we look back upon the past to want to romanticize folks in the past, to kind of idealize them. If this reference goes anywhere, if you remember Lake Wobegon and Garrison Keillor, that fabled place where the women are strong, the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. And to a degree, yes, in the past, there's a lot to admire about people, but there's a trap in forgetting that these folks were human. And Cymbeline, Lucy Fike, she was very human. She told it like it was, or at least how she saw it. And I just thought that there was something really charming about her just bluntness and the way that she would call out her neighbors, her in-laws, her husband. And so it's a very clear, from her perspective, window into what rural life was like on the home front during the Civil War. And so there's a lot in the home front to admire, people pulling together to support the troops, but there is also a lot of bitter feuding. And if you've grown up in a small town or live in a small town, maybe you recognize some of this. There is vicious gossip. I also found that there's a surprising amount of crime that breaks out once men go off to fight during the war. And for Lucy, her most consistent challenges throughout the day was taking care of the couple's spirited toddler, Ellie. For many months, early in this correspondence, Lucy puts her best face forward, but eventually she can't help but speak her mind. And to voice the kinds of sentiments that today working parents know well, that she had too much work, too little time to stay on top of it, and it seemed from the other side of her letters, a spouse who didn't seem to grasp why was she so exhausted. And what I loved is that she eventually calls him out, that while he is in Fort Pickering on garrison duty, just sort of bored out of his skull, he has the ability to write her 2 letters a day, sometimes 3 letters a day. And she is struggling to scribble some things down after she's put her daughter to bed. And so we see in their letters a marriage that is laid bare. This quotation here is one of the ways in which I really like how we see both Fikes are ardent unionists. They're very strongly supportive of the war effort. And Lucy is talking about politics, and she reminds us that women, although not able to vote and not able to hold office, they're deeply invested. They are paying attention, and they have strong opinions. And when she's writing about her anti-war neighbors, the Democrats in Muscuda, whom they called Copperheads, she, in different instances, in this case, I feel like putting on britches now and fighting some of the Copperheads. Another time, she had heard outside her door at night someone hollering for Jeff Davis. And so she told Henry, "I have a stick laid by the door. And the next time that I hear someone hollering for Jeff Davis, I intend to bust their heads and let the copper run out." In July of 1863, she learned that the neighboring town of Fayetteville was planning, like most towns, to have an Independence Day celebration. But over in Fayetteville, the Copperheads were talking about running up a Confederate flag on that most sacred of civic observances. And she told Henry, "The very thought makes me feel like fighting." And then she proceeded to describe how she had an axe ready to ride over to Fayetteville and to chop down any pole that would dare fly such a rag. And it's fun to see in their letters when little Ellie manages to surface, and it's clear that even she absorbs these patriotic values. She tells visitors, for example, that her father had gone off to fight the rebels. She's about 2 years old. "Every good man goes. My pa is good." They talk a lot about the draft. They don't have much time for men who did not muster up the courage to serve their country. Henry will frequently ask her to tell him about the state of what he called the prizes drawn in Uncle Sam's lottery and the market for substitutes in St. Louis. Men could hire other men to take their place. And I found that in 1864, the going rate for substitutes had jumped from what originally had been around $400 to about $1,200. And in Lucy's words, these men don't show much love for country. And so she was just a lot of fun. She was a really outspoken patriot and was actively involved in her Union League. And she gathered lint, she sewed flags, just very invested. I was also struck by their capacity for change politically. We can see in Henry's letters the way that he evolves in his views on slavery and race. He begins this war like most Union soldiers, strongly committed to this idea of union. And in his early letters, Henry uses the kind of language that today in the 21st century we would describe as racist and objectionable. But over the course of his service, he is increasingly dependent upon formerly enslaved men and women for all kinds of labor. As quartermaster, in his quarters, he relies upon them to cook his food, launder his clothes, care for his horse. And he develops especially strong respect for African American troops. They will make good troops, he repeatedly says. And as he moves deeper into the South and develops sustained relationships with these men and women of color, we can see much greater empathy than had been evident early on in the war. And so this war that he had volunteered for to save the Union, he comes to believe in it as well as a struggle to destroy slavery. And so I think that evolution is interesting. Lucy doesn't say as much about slavery and emancipation, but you can find glimpses. Speaking of one of these neighbors who had refused to join the army and was now attempting to evade the draft, and in the words of this neighbor, to fight for the Negroes, this guy gets sick, and when Lucy updates Henry about his health, she does not have much sympathy. Quote, "I don't care much if he dies. Anyone that is so afraid of a bullet as he is ought to be dead." Yeesh. And so this reminds us that in Illinois, the home of the President of the United States at this time, and especially in the southern counties of Illinois, tensions ran way hotter than people may remember. We know Missouri was a border state, but in many ways Illinois was too. It had a lot of residents who did not like Abraham Lincoln and opposed the war. And most of these people were not avowed rebels, but to the Fikes, there was little difference between those who expressed anti-war dissent and the so-called Copperheads that they saw as outright traitors. We can see in their letters the emotional costs of the war. Henry, like most Union volunteers, after the first few months, signs up for a 3-year enlistment. And their prolonged separation plunges Lucy, who stays back in Mascoutah, Illinois, into a sort of melancholy that reads very much like clinical depression. Mascoutah, she wrote Henry, is, quote, "the lonesomest place I ever lived. I expect I will die with the blues. If you hear of my death, you will know the cause of it," end quote. Even worse, she suffered across the war from a series of ailments to rival a latter-day Job. These included debilitating headaches, painful carbuncles and sores upon her back, such intense tooth pain that a dentist eventually removes all of her upper teeth. There are spells during which Ellie is so sick with fever that they fear they will lose her. And they had a failed first pregnancy, and so this is an anxiety that hangs over them. And Henry frequently will say, "Just say the word, and I will come back home." But the Fikes managed to avoid the worst of the health challenges that engulfed Mascoutah. These include typhus, smallpox. Lucy describes the town bells that ring each time a child passes away. And so the book becomes a window into the ways that illness looms over the home front in an era before, modern medicine. So to Henry's service in Missouri, Henry's regiment comes to St. Louis in September 1864, at a moment when Confederate General Sterling Price, former governor of Missouri, has invaded the Ozarks from Arkansas with about 18,000 troops. It seems to the Unionists that the rebels' goal is to capture St. Louis. This prospect brings the war dangerously close to Mascoutah. Union troops had gained control of Missouri some 2 years earlier. That control was strongest in St. Louis, other key towns, the major rivers and railroads, but much of Missouri beyond these points had descended into the most vicious kind of guerrilla violence, and Henry is going to confront this over the course of his march. Price, the former governor, had promised to liberate his state from federal control. He had hoped that jubilant Missourians would flock to his bedraggled army. Many of his men were now lacking shoes and still lacking firearms, and that they would provide his men with fresh supplies and recruits. But from an early point, things do not go as planned for Price and the rebels. Instead of attacking St. Louis, they veer west towards Jefferson City. And to be fair, things had not gone great for Henry and the 117th Illinois. Prior to reaching St. Louis, his steamboat, which is carrying the regiment up, hits a snag and nearly sinks in just outside of Cape Girardeau. But once they eventually do reach Jefferson Barracks south of St. Louis, it seems, as much of the war has been for Henry, a grand adventure. He had participated in some battles in the Red River Campaign at a place called Pleasant Hill in Louisiana. But most of the time he's talking about his military service as this terrific thrill. Jefferson Barracks, because it's so close to St. Clair County, to him is like a county fair. Quote, "There are a great many citizens here on visits to see their friends in the army. Every train that arrives brings them by the dozens. They come, men, women, and children, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, wives, swarms of little ones, all anxious again to see their soldier friends, husbands, sons, and fathers." And he's not so subtle. Hint, hint, please come and bring Ellie to see me. But she doesn't. And so that just feeds what is another theme of their letters. Neither one writes quite enough or comes home quite enough. The threat of invasion, the people across the river in Mascoutah, over here by Belleville, they took quite seriously. When Henry writes, "The city of St. Louis is awake to the state of affairs now existing. All the business houses are closed. The militia is called out. Volunteer companies of exempts are formed, and preparations generally are making for the defense of the city. All the convalescents in camp have been organized and armed into squads." The very next day, Cymbeline wrote that Mascoutah residents were on high alert, expecting that the rebels would cross the river. Quote, "There was quite an excitement in town last night. The news was that Price had crossed the river with his men into Illinois. They called the men together by ringing the bell. They had a big meeting. They rang the bell again. All the business houses here were shut up. I had to laugh to see some of the news carriers when they came along. They looked like their eyes would pop out of their heads when they heard the news that the rebels were here." The rebels, of course, did not cross into Illinois, but this sort of reminds us the ways in which, in an era where the telegraph helps to make instantaneous transmission of news possible, they're still living in a world in which they have imperfect information about the state of affairs. Over the next several weeks, Union troops from St. Louis would follow Price as his rebels moved west across central Missouri. From Jefferson Barracks, Henry and his regiment would move west on what he called the Manchester Road. They're going to stick to what is today Highway 50. He's going to be frustrated at points that they weren't able to hop on the Missouri Pacific and take the trains. But as they move from Kirkwood to Franklin, Gray Summit, Union, Mount Sterling, Lynn, and eventually to Jefferson City, they will always be a day or two behind Sterling Price. Nevertheless, his letters give us some of the most compelling glimpses of Civil War Missouri at that point in time. After spending unpleasant months down in the Deep South, where the Red River Campaign had been a failure, Henry marvels at the cheering response of loyal civilians that they meet along the road. One particular day was quite drizzly. It was wet. He was not feeling good, but yet, quote, "All along the country we saw every indication on the part of the citizens to do their share. Hard marching meant nights of barely 2 hours of sleep. He marveled at the clear, cold waters of the Gasconade, the beauty of the Ozarks, and what really catches his fancy as he moves west to about California are the superb prairies that open up. And he goes on and on about the grasslands in Missouri as being more beautiful than anything he'd seen in Mascoutah, which is table flat. It's prairie ground too, more wet prairie, but he will eventually be so taken with Missouri's prairies that this is where he will relocate after the war. Henry, though, recoiled at Missouri's guerrilla war, which was more brutal than anything he had witnessed in years of soldiering. He described in chilling detail the devastation wrought by Price's invasion. "Tipton and Syracuse," he wrote, "are two nice thriving towns, or were. On Saturday last week, the 8th of this month, the rebels came into Syracuse, about 100 strong, and burned the railroad depot and murdered some 6 or 7 men in cold blood. 4 of the men they called out into the street and drew them up in a line and shot them down like dogs." Henry noted the bodies of murdered men that had been left unburied on the roadside. In the towns west of Jefferson City, Price's army had reportedly killed men who had refused to join their ranks. Henry wrote home on October 13th, 1864, quote, "All the farmers tell the same story. Price had taken all their good horses, killed and eaten many of their cattle, fed up a great deal of their corn without paying for it, and plundered their houses and stores of all clothing and any goods," end quote. But he goes on, quote, "The people all through here who are loyal cannot express their joy at our coming. They wave flags which, no doubt, many times they have had to conceal from the enemy. They even shout. Some weep for joy as they see our boys pass by. Yesterday afternoon, as we passed through, one woman stood with a national flag by the roadside, which she waved for nearly an hour. and our boys kept up a loud shout and cheer all the time they were passing. It was a good sight to see. Our people and friends at home cannot begin to imagine, much less realize, the terrors and trials of war. It has to be seen and to be felt to be fully understood." End quote. Meanwhile, back in Mascouda, with the threat of invasion now dissipated, Cymbeline confronted an unexpected crisis of a different kind. On October 26th, she wrote to Henry, "I have sold all our furniture that I can do without, while it's still a good price. We had too much for our family. I thought I'd better sell it and pay some of our debts than to have it laying around in the dust. Polly told me that you had a note for $400. I told her that you could pay yourself, that I did not know anything about it, that this was the first I ever heard of it. I never heard you say anything about such debts. Henry, I do not know how you ever got yourself in so much debt. I have found out that you owe about $5,000. How it ever happened, I cannot tell. I have about $100 on hand. I thought I would keep part of it, maybe get me some things I've wanted for a long time. Since I have found out how much you owe, I will not get them. If I should, I'd be ashamed to wear them. I cannot see our way out. It troubles me more than anything else on earth. I hope you will come home and arrange your business better than what it is." Unlike many issues that surface in their marriage that they banter back and forth, and you can see them trying to work their way through it like couples do, Henry's surprise indebtedness is one thing that she brings up, and then there is silence for the rest of the war. And I've always wondered, what were those conversations like? They stick it through, and so that they make it out, and they eventually will build a mill in Warrensburg and do just fine financially. But the strains that war puts upon families was a reality across the course of the war. Henry's final letters from Missouri detailed the march west to the Kansas line. They passed through Independence, the Blue Valley, New Santa Fe. He briefly describes Price's resounding defeat at the Battle of Westport, which marked the end of Confederate hopes of retaking Missouri. Henry's regiment, of course, shows up in Jackson County, the scene of the battle, a day late. But he will then be deployed just to the south of Kansas City into Cass County near Harrisonville. And there he will describe the desolation wrought by the Union Army the previous year in its depopulation measure known as Order Number 11, which had ejected the pro-Confederate people living in 4 Missouri counties, driving out as many as 15, perhaps 20,000 people, and so a wasteland. He writes, "We are lying here in camp today and the boys are enjoying the resting spell very much. There's not much news in camp." And here he begins to describe the things that are now just commonplace, as he would once have described the weather. "Only one rebel spy was hung today. Only one bushwhacker shot and another hung. This is no doubt right, as they deserved the fate. We are getting along well, and I think we will probably start towards St. Louis in a day or two." When the 117th Illinois did indeed begin its eastward trek, most of the men now managed to secure a ride on the Missouri Pacific Railroad. But poor Henry Fike, to his chagrin, was charged with leading 128 wagons loaded with ammunition back across the state. And unlike the charms of his previous trip, in which he is praising every village that he comes through, he finds something to point out that he's really smitten with. The return trip takes him through a surprise November snowstorm. And so on November 3rd, he writes, "It commenced snowing before daylight and snowed all day. It was the most disagreeable day, by all odds, I ever knew." And so, feeling this heavy November snow, he gets to Jefferson City and has a much different, jaundiced view of the town that weeks before he had said, "This is a lovely capital city." He now writes, quote, "The Capitol building is a very common one. It has no fence around it. The ground is muddy. It has no trees or any kind of shrubbery. In fact, this whole town is a poor-looking, dirty, muddy place. It looks very much as all towns generally look that are surrounded by and contaminated with secessiondom. However, when the war is over, Missouri becomes a free state. things will likely appear in another light. And so we can see Henry is very much human himself. He does make it back to St. Louis and then to a furlough in Mascoutah in time for Thanksgiving. I used the diary a little bit in, I picture Jefferson Barracks, but got caught up with the Fikes. Another map of Price's Raid. These are the counties that had been depopulated by Union General Thomas Ewing. George Caleb Bingham's famous painting illustrating what Bingham wanted Ewing to remember, how Missourians remembered this and what they thought of Ewing. I use his diary, Henry's diary, at points in the book to contrast with the things that he's saying to Lucy in the letters, and then how sometimes he'll tell a slightly different story within his diary. But in his diary entries over the course of the furlough, they're not writing letters, of course, but we can see that he is finally in a much better mood. Took the cars for Belleville. From there, I went home in a buggy, saw my family. All is well. And for that, I feel thankful. Thank you.